The metallic clatter of surgical instruments hitting the floor echoed through the emergency room like a death knell. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's hands froze mid-examination, her 30 years of medical experience suddenly meaningless against what lay before her on the gurney. The homeless man's weathered fingers had been clutching his neck all night, a nervous tic, she'd assumed. Just another street casualty seeking warmth on this brutal Chicago winter evening. But when the makeshift bandage finally fell away, revealing what festered beneath, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hospital's ambient chaos. The wound wasn't just infected. It wasn't just neglected. What she saw defied every principle of human survival she'd ever learned. The man should have been dead months ago. Yet here he was, conscious and apologetic, his pale blue eyes holding secrets that would shatter everything she thought she knew about medicine and herself. "Ma'am," he rasped, "others need help more than me. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story." Michael Robert Thompson had once commanded respect in these very halls, though not at Chicago General. 7 years ago, he'd walked the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital with the confident stride of a man who'd dedicated his life to saving others. Chief of Emergency Medicine, they'd called him. Dr. Bobby to the nurses who'd worked alongside him for 2 decades. Now, at 62, he was just another ghost haunting Chicago's frozen streets. His salt and pepper beard, once neatly trimmed for hospital rounds, had grown wild and unkempt. The expensive wool coat he'd worn to medical conferences had been replaced by layers of donated clothing, each piece telling its own story of survival. Yet beneath the grime and wear, something remained unchanged. The gentle way he spoke to every soul he encountered, treating each person with the same dignity he'd once reserved for his most distinguished colleagues. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had built her reputation on being unshakable. 45 years old, with steel-gray eyes that had seen every tragedy the city could produce, she'd learned to compartmentalize emotion from duty. Her recent divorce had only reinforced her dedication to work. The hospital had become her sanctuary, her patients, her only family. She ran Chicago General's emergency department with military precision, earning respect through competence rather than charm. What nobody knew was that Sarah carried her own ghosts. 15 years ago, her younger brother Tommy had died during what should have been a routine surgery. The doctor responsible had destroyed her family's faith in the medical system, though she'd never let that tragedy deter her from her calling. Instead, it had made her fiercer, more determined to ensure no family would suffer as hers had. Sacred Heart Refuge sat in the shadow of downtown Chicago's gleaming towers, a beacon for those whom society had forgotten. Father Miguel Santos, a former Army medic turned shelter director, had learned to read the stories written in every homeless face that crossed his threshold. He recognized the difference between those running from something and those running toward hope. Tonight, the winter storm was particularly merciless. The temperature had plummeted to -15 degrees, with winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Inside the shelter's cramped quarters, men and women huddled together, sharing body heat and stories of better days. Michael had been coming to Sacred Heart irregularly for 7 years, always insisting others needed the warm bed more than he did. Father Miguel had watched him quietly minister to the other residents, setting broken bones with torn bed sheets, treating infections with whatever antibiotics he could find discarded from hospital waste. The man was clearly educated, clearly experienced in medicine, yet he carried himself with the humble bearing of someone seeking redemption. Hidden beneath Michael's layers of worn clothing pressed against his chest in a waterproof pouch lay 2 items that connected him to his former life: a faded photograph of a teenage girl with his own blue eyes, and a worn medical license that bore his name, suspended, not revoked, though few would know the difference. December 23rd arrived with the kind of brutal Chicago winter that turned the city into a frozen battlefield. The storm had been building for hours, transforming familiar streets into treacherous obstacle courses of ice and snow. Weather reports warned residents to stay indoors, but for those without homes, there was nowhere to hide from nature's fury. Michael Robert Thompson pulled his threadbare coat tighter as he made his way through the howling wind. Each step was a calculated risk on the slippery sidewalk, but he'd learned to navigate these dangers over 7 years of street survival. His right hand instinctively moved to his neck, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. The constant throbbing pain beneath the makeshift bandage served as a reminder of choices made and prices paid. The blizzard had started early that morning, but Michael hadn't sought shelter immediately. Instead, he'd spent the day checking on others in the homeless community. Elderly Martha, who slept behind the dumpster at 5th Street, young Tommy, who'd been coughing up blood for weeks, and Sarah Jane, who was 8 months pregnant with nowhere to deliver safely. Each person he visited received what medical attention he could provide with his limited supplies: aspirin for Martha's arthritis, cough suppressant for Tommy, vitamins for Sarah Jane. "Doc Bobby," Martha had wheezed when he'd found her shivering in her cardboard shelter, "you're gonna freeze to death out here yourself." "The good Lord never gives you more than you can handle," he'd replied, wrapping her in an extra blanket he'd found. It was one of his father's old sayings, though some days Michael wondered if his father had ever faced anything like this. By evening, the storm had intensified beyond what even the most hardened street veterans could endure. The temperature had dropped to -20, and the wind chill made it feel like 40 below. Ice formed on every surface, turning the city into a crystalline death trap. Even the most stubborn holdouts began making their way toward the few available shelters. Sacred Heart Refuge glowed like a lighthouse in the storm. Father Miguel Santos had been preparing for this moment all day, knowing that nights like this separated the living from the dead. The shelter's capacity was officially 42 beds, but Miguel had learned to be creative with space during emergencies. Mattresses lined every available floor space, and hot coffee brewed continuously in the kitchen. "Padre!" called out Jim Morrison. Not the singer, but a Vietnam veteran who'd been on the streets for 15 years. "You see Doc Bobby anywhere? Haven't spotted him since this morning?" Father Miguel felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. In his 5 years running Sacred Heart, he'd developed an uncanny ability to predict who might not survive particularly harsh nights. Michael Thompson worried him more than most. The man's refusal to accept help, his insistence on caring for others before himself, and that mysterious injury he kept hidden, all signs that pointed toward someone dancing too close to the edge. "I'm sure he'll turn up," Miguel replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "He always does." But as the hours passed and the storm grew more vicious, Michael remained absent. Other regulars trickled in. Big Mike, the construction worker, Donna, the former teacher, Carlos, the cook who'd lost everything to medical bills. Each arrival brought relief to Father Miguel's heart. But Michael's empty space seemed to grow larger with each gust of wind that rattled the shelter's windows. At 10:30, Father Miguel made a decision that went against every safety protocol. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat, grabbed a flashlight and medical kit, and stepped into the storm. The wind immediately tried to knock him off his feet, and the cold bit through his layers like hungry teeth. "Michael!" he called into the darkness, his voice swallowed by the howling gale. "Bobby! Where are you?" He checked the usual spots: the alcove behind First National Bank, the loading dock at Mercy Hospital, the bus stop where Michael sometimes sat when the pain in his neck became unbearable. Nothing. The storm had erased all traces of human presence, turning the city into an alien landscape of white and shadow. Father Miguel was about to give up when he spotted something that didn't belong, a splash of dark color against the pristine snow. His flashlight beam revealed Michael Thompson, collapsed in the doorway of a closed bookstore, his body curled in a defensive position against the cold. "Michael! Can you hear me?" Miguel knelt beside the motionless figure, his medic training kicking in immediately. Michael's lips were blue, his breathing shallow and irregular. But it was his hand that caught Miguel's attention, pressed against his neck with such force that his knuckles had turned white. "Hurts," Michael whispered, barely audible above the storm. "Can't make it stop." "We're getting you out of here," Miguel said, though he knew moving Michael alone in these conditions was nearly impossible. The man was dead weight, and the nearest hospital was 6 blocks through blizzard conditions that had already claimed the lives of 2 people that night. It took Miguel 20 minutes to drag Michael back to Sacred Heart, using a maintenance sled he'd found abandoned in an alley. By the time they reached the shelter, both men were hypothermic, their movements sluggish and confused. "Call 911!" Miguel shouted as he hauled Michael through the shelter's doors. "Tell them we need an ambulance now." The other residents gathered around as Miguel performed his assessment. Michael's vital signs were dangerously weak, and the mysterious neck injury seemed to be causing him excruciating pain. Whatever was beneath that bandage had gotten significantly worse. "No hospitals," Michael mumbled through chattering teeth. "Others need the bed more." "Some battles are worth fighting alone," Miguel replied, pulling blankets around Michael's shivering form. "But not tonight, my friend. Tonight, you let others help you." The ambulance arrived 45 minutes later, the paramedics exhausted from battling the storm and the unprecedented number of emergency calls. They found Michael semi-conscious, his hand still clutching his neck, muttering about patients who needed care and a girl who needed protection. "What's his story?" asked the lead paramedic as they loaded Michael onto a stretcher. Father Miguel looked down at the man who had spent years caring for others while neglecting himself. "He's someone who forgot that healing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary." As the ambulance disappeared into the storm, heading toward Chicago General Hospital, Miguel said a silent prayer. He'd seen enough death in the army and enough despair on the streets to recognize when someone was standing at a crossroads between life and something else entirely. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside Sacred Heart Refuge, 41 souls were safe and warm. One space remained empty, and Miguel found himself staring at it, wondering if Michael Thompson would ever return to fill it again. The harsh fluorescent lights of Chicago General's emergency room cast everything in stark, unforgiving relief. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been working for 16 straight hours, fueled by nothing but coffee and the relentless pace of winter emergencies. The storm had brought them everything: heart attacks from people shoveling snow, car accidents on icy roads, hypothermia cases, and the usual parade of human misery that filled every urban ER. When the ambulance doors burst open at 11:47 p.m., Sarah barely looked up from the chart she was reviewing. Another homeless patient, she assumed, the third one tonight. The city's most vulnerable always suffered first when nature turned cruel. 62-year-old male, the paramedic called out as they wheeled the stretcher past her station. Found collapsed in a doorway, hypothermia, possible malnutrition, and he keeps clutching his neck. Says it's been hurting for months. Sarah sighed and grabbed her stethoscope. Emergency medicine had taught her to categorize quickly: life-threatening, urgent, or stable. Most homeless patients, unfortunately, fell into a predictable pattern: neglected health issues, substance abuse, mental illness. She'd treat them with professional competence, but her emotional reserves were saved for cases where she could make a real difference. The man on the gurney appeared unconscious, his weathered face partially obscured by an unkempt beard. His clothes were layered and worn, typical of someone who owned everything he wore, but something about him struck Sarah as different. There was a dignity in his posture, even in unconsciousness, that spoke of a different life. "Let's get him to bed 3, Sarah instructed the nurses. "Start with the usual protocol, warm blankets, IV fluids, and let's get his core temperature up." As they transferred Michael to the examination bed, his eyes fluttered open. Sarah found herself looking into pale blue irises that held an unexpected clarity. Most hypothermia patients were confused and disoriented, but this man's gaze was sharp, aware. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying a slight southern accent, "I appreciate the kindness, but I suspect you have folks who need this bed more than I do." Sarah blinked in surprise. The vocabulary, the sentence structure, the polite formality, this wasn't the speech pattern she expected from someone pulled off the streets. "Sir, you nearly froze to death tonight. Let us worry about who needs what." "Yes, ma'am." Michael's hand moved instinctively to his neck, wincing as he touched whatever was hidden beneath the grimy bandage. "But I've seen worse conditions than this, and I know how emergency departments work. Your resources are limited, and there are people—" "Wait." Sarah held up her hand, studying Michael more carefully. "You know how emergency departments work?" Michael's eyes grew guarded. I've spent some time around hospitals." Something in his tone made Sarah pay closer attention. She began her standard examination, checking his pulse, blood pressure, and respiratory rate. But as she worked, she noticed things that didn't fit the profile. His fingernails were clean despite his circumstances. His posture suggested good muscle memory for medical procedures. And when she reached for his wrist to check his pulse, he automatically positioned his arm in exactly the right way. "Sir, I need to examine that wound on your neck," Sarah said, reaching toward the makeshift bandage. Michael's hand shot up to stop her, the movement quick and defensive. "Ma'am, I'd prefer if you didn't. It's not as bad as it looks, and like I said, there are others who—" "Ma'am, I believe you'll want to check the carotid pulse first," Michael interrupted himself, then looked startled as if the words had escaped without permission. Sarah froze. Only someone with medical training would think to mention the carotid pulse in this context. Only someone who understood the significance of neck injuries would suggest that particular assessment. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. Michael closed his eyes, a look of resignation crossing his features. "Nobody important, doctor. Just someone who's taken up too much of your time already." But Sarah's instincts were fully engaged now. The way he said doctor, with respect but also with familiarity, as if he'd used the title himself. The medical knowledge, the careful avoidance of her questions about the neck wound. "I need to see what's under that bandage," she said firmly. "Please," Michael whispered, and for the first time his composure cracked. "Please don't." The desperation in his voice only strengthened Sarah's resolve. In her experience, when patients were this resistant to examination, it usually meant they were hiding something significant, either medically dangerous or emotionally traumatic. "I understand you're scared," she said gently, "but I can't help you if I don't know what's wrong." Michael shook his head slowly. "You can't help me anyway, doctor. Some things can't be fixed." The resignation in his voice, the way he seemed to accept suffering as inevitable, it reminded Sarah of patients who'd given up hope entirely. But there was something else, something that nagged at her consciousness, like a half-remembered melody. "The good Lord never gives you more than you can handle," Michael murmured, seeming to speak more to himself than to her. "But sometimes he comes pretty close to the line." Sarah had heard that phrase before, though she couldn't place where. She made another attempt to examine the neck wound, and this time Michael didn't resist as strongly. His hand fell away, and she could see that the bandage was actually quite skillfully applied, not the amateur wrapping she'd expect from someone living on the streets. "Who taught you to dress wounds like this?" she asked. Michael's laugh was bitter. "I used to know a thing or two about medicine. Long time ago." "Used to know?" Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. "What kind of medicine?" Before Michael could answer, his body went rigid with pain. His back arched, his hand flew to his neck, and a sound escaped him that Sarah had heard only from patients in the most extreme agony. "Get me 5 milligulars morphine," she called to the nurse, then turned back to Michael. "I'm sorry, but I have to see what's causing this." With quick, efficient movements, she began unwrapping the bandage around Michael's neck. Layer after layer of gauze and tape came away, revealing the careful work of someone who understood wound care. But nothing prepared her for what lay beneath. The final layer of gauze stuck slightly, adherent with dried blood and infection. When Sarah peeled it away, she had to grip the bedside rail to keep from staggering backward. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the emergency room. The wound wasn't just infected. It wasn't just neglected. What she saw defied every principle of human survival she'd ever learned. The tissue was necrotic around the edges, clearly the result of months or even years of poor healing. But the shape, the location, the precise nature of the damage, it looked surgical. It looked like someone had tried to perform an operation on themselves. "How long?" she managed to ask. Michael's eyes met hers, and she saw decades of pain reflected there. "About 2 years since this got bad. But the original problem?" He paused, his breathing shallow. "That goes back much further, Doctor." "You did this to yourself," Sarah said, though it was barely a question. "Sometimes a man's got to know his limitations," Michael replied, his voice growing weaker. "And sometimes he's got to try anyway." Sarah's mind raced through the medical implications. Self-performed surgery was almost always fatal. The infection alone should have killed him months ago. The fact that he was alive, conscious, and coherent suggested either incredible luck or incredible skill, or both. "You're going to surgery," she said firmly. "Tonight." "No." Michael's voice carried surprising strength. "I told you there are others." "There are no others," Sarah interrupted, her professional demeanor cracking. "There's just you, right now, and a wound that should have killed you already." As she called for the surgical team, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial about the man lying before her. Something about his eyes, his voice, the way he spoke about medicine, something that would change everything she thought she knew about the past 15 years of her life. The surgical prep room at Chicago General had seen thousands of patients, but few had generated as much hushed conversation among the medical staff as the homeless man currently being prepared for emergency surgery. Word had spread quickly through the hospital about the self-inflicted wound, and curious residents and nurses found excuses to walk past the prep area. Dr. Sarah Mitchell scrubbed her hands with methodical precision, her mind racing through the complexities of what she was about to attempt. The infection had spread deeper than initially apparent, and the scar tissue from Michael's amateur surgery had created a landscape of anatomical confusion that would challenge even the most experienced surgeon. "Dr. Mitchell?" Nurse Jennifer Walsh approached hesitantly. "The patient is asking to speak with you before we begin." Sarah dried her hands and walked to Michael's bedside. The pre-surgical medications had relaxed him somewhat, but his eyes remained alert and focused. "Doctor," Michael said quietly, "I need you to know something before you begin. If something goes wrong, and there's a good chance it will, there's a girl who needs to know what happened to me." "You're going to be fine," Sarah replied automatically, though privately she harbored serious doubts about the surgery's outcome. Her name is Rebecca Thompson, Michael continued, ignoring Sarah's reassurance. She's 16, lives with the Hendersons on Oak Street. Foster family. Good people. His voice grew softer. She doesn't know I'm alive, and maybe that's for the best. But if something happens to me, she should know that someone was watching out for her. Sarah felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. The idea of this man watching over a teenage girl from the streets, protecting her from the shadows of his own fallen life, struck her as both heartbreaking and heroic. Why doesn't she know you're alive? Michael's laugh was bitter. Because sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is disappear from their life. Sometimes your presence causes more harm than your absence. As the anesthesia began to take effect, Michael's words became more fragmented, his defenses lowered by the medication. Sarah found herself leaning closer, trying to catch his whispered confessions. "The girl at St. Mary's," he mumbled, his eyes losing focus. "Couldn't save her. Tried everything. Equipment failed. But they needed someone to blame. Let them blame me. Had to protect the hospital. Had to protect Margaret. Failed at that too." "What girl?" Sarah asked, but Michael had slipped into unconsciousness. The surgery lasted 4 hours. What Sarah had expected to be a relatively straightforward debridement and repair turned into a complex reconstruction of damaged tissue and blood vessels. Michael's amateur surgical attempt had been surprisingly sophisticated. Whoever had taught him medicine had taught him well, but the infection and poor healing had created complications that tested every skill Sarah possessed. During the procedure, Sarah discovered something that made her hands pause mid-suture. Hidden in the scar tissue, barely visible among the damaged flesh, was a small metal object. Under the surgical lights, it gleamed with familiar letters. A hospital ID badge, so corroded by infection and time that only fragments were legible. "Dr. Tho," she could make out, and below it, "Chief of M." Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd seen badges like this before, the old-style identification cards used at St. Mary's Hospital until their system upgrade 12 years ago. The partial letters, the title, the era, pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. "Doctor, his blood pressure is dropping," the anesthesiologist announced. "We need to wrap this up." Sarah forced herself to focus on the immediate crisis, but the badge remained in her peripheral vision, a small piece of metal that seemed to pulse with significance. When the surgery was finally complete, she quietly pocketed the corroded ID, telling herself she'd return it to Michael when he recovered. If he recovered. The post-surgical period was touch and go. Michael developed complications that kept him in the ICU for 3 days, hovering between consciousness and delirium. During his lucid moments, he spoke little, but Sarah noticed that his medical vocabulary remained precise and professional. He asked about his surgical site with the clinical detachment of someone who understood anatomy, inquired about his antibiotic regimen with the knowledge of someone familiar with infection protocols. On the 4th day, Michael was stable enough for transfer to a regular room. Sarah found herself visiting more frequently than her duties required, drawn by questions she couldn't articulate. There was something hauntingly familiar about his presence, though she was certain they'd never met before. "Doctor," Michael said during one of her visits, "I know you have questions about me, about who I used to be." Sarah pulled up a chair beside his bed. "I'm more interested in who you are now. A man who's been living on the streets for 7 years but still has the medical knowledge to perform surgery on himself. A man who watches over a teenage girl he claims can't know he exists. A man who carries himself like someone who once commanded respect." Michael stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "I was someone else once. Someone who thought he could save everyone. Someone who learned the hard way that sometimes the system you serve doesn't serve you back." "St. Mary's Hospital?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Michael's head turned sharply toward her. "How did you—" "I found something during your surgery." Sarah pulled the corroded ID badge from her pocket and placed it on the bedside table. This was embedded in the scar tissue. Michael stared at the badge as if it were a venomous snake. "I thought I'd thrown that away." "Dr. Thompson," Sarah read the partial letters aloud. "Chief of Emergency Medicine, St. Mary's Hospital. That was you, wasn't it?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Finally, Michael nodded. "Michael Robert Thompson. I ran the emergency department at St. Mary's for 18 years, until 7 years ago, when everything fell apart." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly around her. St. Mary's Hospital. 7 years ago. The memories she'd worked so hard to suppress came flooding back. The phone call in the middle of the night, the desperate rush to the hospital, the devastating news that would shatter her family forever. "What happened 7 years ago?" she asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. Michael's eyes filled with pain that went far deeper than his physical wounds. "A 15-year-old boy was brought in after a car accident. Multiple trauma, internal bleeding. We tried an experimental procedure to save his life. The equipment failed during surgery. The boy died." Sarah's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What was the boy's name?" "Tommy," Michael whispered. "Tommy Mitchell." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Tommy Mitchell, her baby brother, the golden child of the family, the kid who'd wanted to be a doctor just like his big sister. The boy whose death had driven their parents into divorce and despair, whose memory had haunted Sarah's dreams for 15 years. "You," she said, her voice barely audible. "You killed my brother." Michael closed his eyes and tears began to leak from the corners. "Yes, I did. And I've been dying a little more each day ever since." The revelation hung between them like a live wire, crackling with years of grief and guilt and misplaced blame. Sarah stood up so quickly her chair tipped over backward, the crash echoing through the small room like a gunshot. 15 years, she whispered, backing toward the door. 15 years I've wondered about the doctor who killed Tommy. 15 years of imagining what kind of monster would let a child die. "Dr. Mitchell," Michael said softly, "I know there's nothing I can say." "You're right." Sarah cut him off, her professional composure completely shattered. "There's nothing. Nothing you can say will bring him back. Nothing will undo what you did to my family." She turned and fled the room, leaving Michael alone with his guilt and the corroded ID badge that had finally revealed the truth neither of them had been prepared to face. In the hallway outside, Sarah leaned against the wall and tried to catch her breath. The homeless man she'd been treating with growing respect and curiosity was the same person who had haunted her nightmares for 15 years. The man whose apparent selflessness had begun to touch her heart was the same one who had destroyed her family's faith in medicine and mercy. The confrontation between Sarah and Michael had been witnessed by enough hospital staff that word spread quickly through Chicago General's corridors. Nurses whispered in medication rooms, residents exchanged glances during rounds, and the story grew with each telling. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the unflappable chief of emergency medicine, had fled a patient's room in tears after discovering that the homeless man she'd been treating was responsible for her brother's death 15 years ago. Sarah found herself in the hospital chapel, a place she rarely visited despite its proximity to the emergency department. The small, non-denominational space offered silence and shadows, two things she desperately needed. She sat in the back pew, staring at the simple wooden cross on the wall, trying to process the collision between her past and present. For 15 years, she had carried the weight of Tommy's death like a stone in her chest. Her brilliant little brother, Only 15, but already talking about medical school, about following in her footsteps. The night of the accident, she'd been finishing her residency at Northwestern, and the call had come at 2:17 a.m. By the time she reached St. Mary's, Tommy was already in surgery. She remembered waiting in that horrible family conference room with its beige walls and tissue boxes strategically placed on every table. Her parents had been inconsolable, clinging to each other and to hope. The surgeon who eventually emerged to deliver the devastating news had been a blur to her grief-stricken mind, tall, middle-aged, with kind eyes that couldn't quite meet theirs as he explained about experimental procedures and equipment failures and everything they'd tried to save Tommy's life. Dr. Michael Thompson. The name had been burned into her memory during the malpractice investigation that followed, but she'd never connected it to the broken man lying in room 314. Dr. Mitchell? Father Miguel's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find the shelter director standing at the entrance to the chapel, his expression concerned. I heard about what happened. I came as soon as I could. How did you know I was here? Nurse Walsh told me where to find you. She's worried about you. Miguel took a seat in the pew beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. She also told me about Michael, about your brother. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. You're Michael Thompson, the man you've been protecting and praising for years, is the doctor who killed my 15-year-old brother, the man whose negligence destroyed my family. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in prayer position. Finally, he spoke. I've known Michael for 7 years. In that time, I've watched him save more lives than I can count. Homeless people who would have died from infections, overdoses, exposure, he's pulled them back from the edge with nothing but expired medications and makeshift supplies. That doesn't bring Tommy back. No, Miguel agreed. It doesn't. But maybe it explains why he's tried so hard to die himself. Sarah turned to look at the priest more closely. What do you mean? The wound on his neck. That wasn't his first attempt at self-harm. I've seen the scars on his wrists, the deliberate way he puts himself in danger during the worst weather. Michael Thompson has been trying to atone for something for 7 years, but he's never told me what. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah thought about Michael's behavior since his arrival, his insistence that others needed care more than he did, his acceptance of pain as if it were deserved punishment, his refusal to accept help or comfort. The night Tommy died, Sarah said slowly, the doctor explained that they'd tried an experimental procedure, that the equipment had failed, that they'd done everything possible. And you didn't believe him? The lawsuit suggested otherwise. The hospital settled out of court, and the doctor's career was destroyed. If he was innocent, why didn't he fight it? Miguel stood and walked to the small altar, running his fingers along the edge of the wooden cross. Sometimes people accept blame they don't deserve because it serves a greater purpose. Sometimes they sacrifice themselves to protect others. Before Sarah could respond, her pager buzzed with an urgent message. Room 314, Michael's room, needed immediate attention. Her medical training overrode her emotional turmoil, and she found herself running through the hospital corridors toward the patient who had just turned her world upside down. She arrived to find Michael in the midst of a severe panic attack, his breathing rapid and shallow, his vital signs dangerously erratic. The cardiac monitor showed an irregular rhythm that suggested his heart was struggling under extreme stress. What happened? Sarah asked the attending nurse as she moved to Michael's bedside. He's been like this for about 20 minutes, Nurse Walsh explained. Started right after you left. He keeps asking for someone named Margaret and talking about protecting someone. Sarah looked down at Michael's face, contorted with anguish that went far beyond physical pain. Despite everything she'd learned about him, Despite the hatred she'd carried for 15 years, her medical instincts took over. "Michael," she said firmly, placing her hand on his shoulder, "you need to control your breathing. You're hyperventilating." His eyes focused on her with desperate intensity. "Dr. Mitchell," he gasped. "I have to tell you, have to explain, not now. Right now, I need you to breathe with me." Sarah demonstrated the slow, deep breathing technique she used with anxious patients. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. As Michael's breathing gradually stabilized, Sarah found herself studying his face more carefully. The years of homelessness had aged him, but beneath the weathered exterior, she could see traces of the man who had once commanded respect in hospital corridors. There was something in his expression, a crushing weight of responsibility and guilt that seemed familiar. "The equipment failure," Michael whispered when his breathing had normalized. "It wasn't random. Someone in hospital administration knew the surgical unit had been reported for maintenance issues 3 times in the previous month. They chose not to act on it because the repair cost would have affected the quarterly budget." Sarah felt her carefully constructed narrative about Tommy's death beginning to shift. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that when your brother died, I had a choice. I could expose the administration's negligence and destroy the hospital's reputation, putting hundreds of jobs at risk and potentially shutting down the only Level 1 trauma center serving the South Side. Or I could accept responsibility and let them use me as a scapegoat." The room seemed to grow smaller around them. Sarah's mind raced back through the details of the malpractice case, the hospital's quick settlement, the way Michael Thompson had seemed to disappear from the medical community afterward. "You let them destroy you to save the hospital?" Michael's laugh was hollow. "I let them destroy me to save my wife." Margaret had been battling depression for years, and the stress of a prolonged legal battle would have killed her. She died anyway, 2 years later, from the shame of being married to the doctor who killed a child. Sarah sank into the bedside chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The story she'd believed for 15 years, the narrative of a negligent doctor and a preventable death, was crumbling around her. "The girl you mentioned," she said quietly, "Rebecca Thompson. She's your granddaughter?" "My son David's daughter. When Margaret died, David blamed me for everything. He took Becca and cut off all contact. Told her I was dead." Michael's voice broke slightly. "Maybe he was right. Maybe I should have been." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. This broken man lying before her hadn't just been carrying the guilt of Tommy's death. He'd been carrying the weight of his entire family's destruction, all while believing he'd made the right choice to protect others. "The self-surgery," she said, understanding dawning. "You were trying to remove something. What was it?" Michael's hand moved automatically to his neck. "A locket Margaret gave me for our 20th anniversary. Has her picture in it. The chain got infected where it rubbed against my skin, but I couldn't bear to take it off, so I tried to cut it out instead." Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the tragedy of it all. A man so consumed by guilt and grief that he'd literally tried to carve his memories from his flesh. A grandfather secretly watching over the girl who thought he was dead. A doctor who'd sacrificed everything to protect others and had been slowly dying from the weight of that sacrifice ever since. The hatred she'd carried for 15 years felt suddenly heavy and misplaced, like armor worn long after the battle had ended. The weight of 15 years of misdirected anger crashed down on Sarah like a collapsing building. She sat beside Michael's hospital bed, staring at this man who had haunted her nightmares, realizing that everything she thought she knew about her brother's death had been built on a foundation of lies and institutional cover-ups. "I need to see the records," Sarah said quietly. "The real records from that night." Michael shook his head weakly. They were sealed as part of the settlement agreement. The hospital made sure of that. I work here now. I have access to archived files that most people don't. Sarah's mind was already working through the possibilities. If what you're saying is true, if there really was a cover-up— It won't bring your brother back, Michael interrupted, his voice filled with the exhaustion of a man who had carried impossible burdens for too long. And it won't give me back the 7 years I've spent on the streets, or my wife, or my relationship with my son and granddaughter. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city where both their lives had been shattered. The Chicago skyline glittered in the darkness, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to the truth that was finally emerging from decades of carefully maintained silence. But it might give us both something we need, she said. The truth. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah Mitchell became a woman possessed. Using her administrative access and calling in favors from colleagues who had worked at various Chicago hospitals, she began to piece together the real story of what had happened the night Tommy died. The maintenance records for the surgical equipment at St. Mary's revealed a pattern of negligence that was breathtaking in its scope. The machine that had failed during Tommy's surgery had been flagged for repair no fewer than 5 times in the 3 months preceding the accident. Each time, the repairs had been deferred due to budget constraints and scheduling conflicts. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, the former head of hospital administration, had died 2 years earlier, but her personal assistant from that era was still alive and working at a suburban medical clinic. When Sarah tracked her down, the woman initially refused to discuss the events of 15 years ago. "I signed confidentiality agreements," Martha Kowalski explained over coffee in a downtown diner. "I could be sued for breach of contract." "The statute of limitations has run out," Sarah pressed, "and Dr. Hartley is dead. The only person who could sue you is the hospital, and they have bigger problems to worry about now." Martha, a woman in her 60s with tired eyes and silver hair, finally relented. What she revealed made Sarah's blood run cold. "Dr. Thompson fought them every step of the way," Martha said quietly. "When that boy died, he demanded a full investigation. He wanted to expose everything: the deferred maintenance, the budget cuts, the pressure to keep costs down even when it compromised patient safety. Dr. Hartley told him that if he pushed forward with his concerns, she would make sure he was personally blamed for the death. And if he didn't push forward? She promised the family would receive a substantial settlement, no questions asked. The hospital would take care of them financially, and Dr. Thompson's reputation would be managed. Sarah felt sick. Managed how? They let him take the fall, but quietly. No criminal charges, no public scandal that would have destroyed the hospital. Just a malpractice settlement and a career that disappeared overnight. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Father Miguel had returned to the hospital to check on Michael and found Sarah in the medical records room at 2 in the morning, surrounded by files and looking like she hadn't slept in days. "There's something you need to know about Michael," he said, settling into a chair across from her desk. "Something that might change how you see all of this." Sarah looked up from the documents that had consumed her attention. "What?" "The anonymous donations to homeless shelters across the city. The medical supplies that somehow always appear when we need them most. The way certain pharmaceutical companies have been quietly providing expired medications that somehow find their way to people who can't afford treatment." Miguel paused, studying Sarah's face. "That's all been Michael. That's impossible. He's been living on the streets." "Has he?" Miguel pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I did some checking of my own. Michael Thompson maintains a small apartment on the west side. Nothing fancy, a studio above a grocery store, but he's had it for 6 years. Sarah stared at the address on the paper. "Then why does he come to the shelter?" "Because he's not staying there for himself. He's been using it as a base of operations to help other people. The apartment is where he stores medical supplies, where he treats the more serious cases that need privacy and time to heal. The implications hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. Michael hadn't just been surviving on the streets. He'd been running an underground medical clinic for the city's most vulnerable population, using his own limited resources, his medical knowledge, and apparently whatever remained of his professional connections to provide health care to people the system had abandoned. "The settlement money," Sarah said suddenly. "The malpractice settlement from Tommy's case. Where did it go?" Miguel's expression grew sad. "Michael never took a penny of it. It all went to your family, plus additional funds that came from his personal savings and his wife's life insurance policy after she died. Your parents never knew. But the money that helped them rebuild their lives after Tommy's death came from the man they blamed for destroying those lives." Sarah felt the last of her anger crumble into something far more complex, a mixture of grief, admiration, and overwhelming guilt for the hatred she'd carried for so many years. "I have to tell my parents," she whispered. "You have to tell them the truth," Miguel corrected. "All of it. But first, I think you need to tell Michael something." "What?" "That you forgive him. Not because he needs your forgiveness. He's been carrying that guilt whether he deserves it or not. But because you need to give it. For your own sake." That evening, Sarah returned to Michael's room carrying a manila folder full of documents and a heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. She found him awake, staring at the ceiling, his hands folded over his chest in a posture that looked disturbingly peaceful. "I know the truth now," she said without preamble, "about the equipment failure, about the cover-up, about the settlement money. I know what really happened that night." Michael turned his head to look at her, and she saw fear in his eyes. Fear that the truth might somehow make things worse rather than better. "I also know about the medical supplies, the apartment, the people you've been helping for all these years." Sarah sat down heavily in the bedside chair. "I know that while I've been hating you for 15 years, you've been trying to save as many lives as possible to make up for the one you couldn't save." "It doesn't balance," Michael said quietly. "No number of lives saved can bring back your brother." "No," Sarah agreed, "but maybe that was never the point. Maybe the point was that you never stopped being a doctor, even when the system tried to destroy you for being one." They sat in silence for several minutes, two people who had been shaped by the same tragedy in vastly different ways, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. "There's something else," Sarah said eventually. "Your granddaughter, Rebecca. I contacted her foster family. She's been asking questions about her family history, about what happened to her grandfather. They've been wondering whether they should tell her the truth." Michael's composure finally cracked completely. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as years of suppressed grief and longing poured out of him. "She's better off not knowing," he sobbed. "She's got a good life, good people taking care of her." "Why would she want to know about someone like me?" Sarah reached over and took his hand, the same hands that had tried desperately to save her brother, the same hands that had been saving lives in the shadows ever since. "Because," she said softly, "everyone deserves to know they're loved, even when the person loving them thinks they don't deserve to be known." The revelation of truth, rather than bringing immediate peace, seemed to unleash a torrent of consequences that neither Sarah nor Michael had anticipated. Within days of Sarah's discovery, the carefully constructed walls that had protected various parties for 15 years began to crumble with devastating swiftness. Sarah's first call had been to her parents, James and Linda Mitchell, who now lived in a quiet retirement community in Arizona. The conversation lasted 3 hours and left all three of them emotionally shattered. Her father, who had spent 15 years believing that a negligent doctor had killed his son, found himself confronting the reality that the same doctor had anonymously funded their grief counseling, helped pay for Linda's medical treatments during her breakdown, and even contributed to the scholarship fund they'd established in Tommy's name. "How do we live with this?" her mother had asked through tears during their video call. "How do we live knowing we've hated someone who was trying to help us heal?" The question haunted Sarah as she prepared for the most difficult conversation of her professional life. The Illinois State Medical Board had agreed to reopen Michael Thompson's case based on the evidence she'd uncovered, but first she needed Michael to agree to cooperate with their investigation. She found him in the hospital's small garden, a therapeutic space designed for patient recovery. Despite being cleared for discharge, Michael had nowhere to go. His small apartment had been discovered by local media, and reporters were camped outside Sacred Heart Refuge, hoping for an interview with the homeless hero doctor, as the Chicago Tribune had dubbed him. "The story leaked," Sarah said as she approached the bench where Michael sat feeding breadcrumbs to a handful of sparrows. "Someone at the hospital talked to a journalist. It'll be front page tomorrow." Michael didn't look surprised. "I figured it would come out eventually. Truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it." Sarah handed him a copy of the preliminary article she'd obtained from a contact at the Tribune. The headline read, "The Doctor Who Disappeared: How Chicago's Medical Elite Destroyed an Innocent Man." The story was devastating in its thoroughness, documenting not just the cover-up around Tommy's death, but the pattern of budget cuts and safety compromises that had plagued St. Mary's Hospital during Elizabeth Hartley's tenure. "There's going to be a congressional investigation," Sarah continued. "The state attorney general wants to pursue criminal charges against the administrators who were involved in the cover-up. Your name is going to be cleared officially." Michael crumpled the newspaper and tossed it in a nearby trash bin. 15 years too late for Margaret. 7 years too late for any relationship with my son. What's the point of vindication when everyone you cared about is either dead or gone? Before Sarah could respond, a commotion near the hospital's main entrance caught their attention. A young woman with Michael's distinctive blue eyes was arguing with security guards, demanding to see Michael Thompson, the homeless man who's been in the news. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "That's Rebecca, isn't it?" Michael's face went white. His granddaughter had grown into a beautiful 16-year-old with determined features and an unmistakable resemblance to the man who'd been watching over her from the shadows for 7 years. She wore the uniform of St. Catherine's Preparatory School, one of Chicago's most prestigious private institutions, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd been raised with love and opportunity. "She can't see me like this," Michael said, starting to stand. "She thinks I'm dead. It's better that way." "Is it?" Sarah asked. "Better for who?" The question hung in the air as they watched Rebecca finally convince the security guards to let her pass. She was walking directly toward the garden, her expression a mixture of hope and determination that reminded Sarah painfully of Tommy at that age. "Grandfather?" Rebecca's voice carried across the garden space, clear and strong. She stopped about 10 feet away from the bench, studying Michael's face with the intensity of someone trying to match a memory with reality. "Are you my grandfather?" Michael couldn't speak. 15 years of imagined conversations, of watching this child grow up from a distance, of wondering what she might think of him. None of it had prepared him for this moment of direct confrontation with the granddaughter, who was supposed to believe he was dead. "I've been researching our family history," Rebecca continued when Michael remained silent. "The Hendersons, my foster parents, they've been honest with me about everything. They told me my father said you were dead, but they never believed it. They said a dead man doesn't send anonymous birthday cards every year with specific details about my achievements that only family would know." Sarah watched Michael's composure completely disintegrate. The birthday cards, another secret kindness he'd maintained despite his exile. "They also told me," Rebecca said, taking a step closer, "that someone has been paying for my private school tuition, my medical bills, even my college fund. Someone who signs the checks, a friend of the family, but whose bank account traces back to a Michael R. Thompson. The financial revelation stunned even Sarah. Michael had been funding his granddaughter's entire life while living as a homeless man, sacrificing his own comfort and security to ensure she had opportunities he'd lost. "Why?" Rebecca asked, and her voice finally broke with emotion. "Why did you let me think you were dead? Why did you let Dad tell me you were some kind of monster who'd destroyed our family?" Michael stood slowly, his hands shaking. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because monsters don't deserve to be loved by angels, and you, sweetheart, have always been an angel." "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Rebecca said, and despite her tears, there was a flash of anger in her voice that reminded Sarah of Michael's own fierce determination. "Do you think I care about what happened 15 years ago? Do you think I care about some medical lawsuit or hospital politics or any of that garbage?" She closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around Michael's neck, holding him with the desperate strength of someone who'd been missing a piece of themselves without realizing it. "I care that my grandfather has been living on the streets while making sure I had everything I needed," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I care that you've been alone and hurting while I was growing up thinking I didn't have any real family left." Michael's arms came up around her slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Sarah found herself turning away from the reunion, giving them privacy for a moment that had been 7 years in the making. When she looked back, she saw 3 generations of healing beginning to take place on a simple hospital garden bench. Michael was holding Rebecca like she might disappear, while she was crying into his shoulder and asking 1,000 questions about where he'd been and why he'd stayed away and whether he knew that she was planning to study medicine so she could help people the way he had. "There's something else," Sarah said gently, not wanting to intrude but knowing that the moment couldn't last forever. "Your father, Rebecca, he's been looking for you." Both Michael and Rebecca looked up in surprise. "David's been trying to reach you since the story broke," Sarah continued. "Apparently he never actually believed you were dead either. He's been carrying his own guilt about cutting you off from Rebecca's life. The investigator he hired to track you down found the apartment, found records of your donations to homeless charities, found evidence that you've been taking care of people for years." Michael's expression grew guarded. "David made his choice 7 years ago." "People change," Rebecca said firmly. "People learn. People realize they made mistakes." She looked directly at her grandfather with eyes that seemed far older than her 16 years. "Isn't that what forgiveness is for?" The question hung in the air as Sarah realized that all of them, herself included, were standing at the threshold of something new. The past couldn't be changed, the dead couldn't be brought back to life, and the years of separation and pain couldn't be erased. But perhaps with enough courage and grace, the future could be written differently than the past. "Your father is flying in from Denver tomorrow," Sarah said quietly. "He wants to see both of you." For the first time in 7 years, Michael Thompson smiled with something that looked like hope. 6 months after the revelation that changed everything, Michael Thompson stood in the bathroom of his new apartment, adjusting the collar of a shirt that still felt foreign after years of layered clothing chosen for survival rather than appearance. The small mirror reflected a man who looked remarkably different from the broken figure who'd been pulled from a snowbank that December night. Regular meals had filled out his gaunt cheeks, medical care had healed the chronic pain that had plagued him for years, and most importantly, the constant weight of isolation had been lifted from his shoulders. The apartment itself was modest, a 1-bedroom unit in a building that catered to medical professionals working at nearby hospitals. Sarah had helped him find it, insisting that he needed a place that felt like home rather than just shelter. The walls were decorated with framed photographs that told the story of his redemption. Rebecca at her high school graduation, David during his first visit to Chicago in 7 years, and a picture of all three generations of Thompsons taken at Thanksgiving dinner. Today marked another milestone in Michael's journey back to the living. The Illinois State Medical Board had officially restored his license after a thorough review that not only cleared him of any wrongdoing in Tommy Mitchell's death, but commended him for his years of volunteer medical work in Chicago's homeless community. More significantly, Chicago General Hospital had offered him a position that seemed designed specifically for his unique experiences and skills. Dr. Sarah Mitchell knocked on his door at exactly 7:30 a.m., a punctuality that had become their routine over the months of rebuilding their relationship. What had begun as professional courtesy between colleagues had evolved into something deeper, not romantic, but the kind of profound friendship that can only exist between people who've walked through fire together and emerged transformed. "Ready for your first day back in official medicine?" Sarah asked as Michael locked his apartment door. "The good Lord never gives you more than you can handle," Michael replied, though his smile suggested he was more nervous than his familiar phrase implied. "But I'm starting to think he might have an optimistic view of my capabilities." The Sacred Heart Community Health Clinic was housed in a converted warehouse 3 blocks from the shelter where Father Miguel had first pulled Michael back from the brink. The building had been renovated with funding from an unexpected source: the massive settlement Chicago General had received when the truth about the saint. Mary's hospital cover-up had led to a class action lawsuit that exposed decades of systematic negligence across the city's hospital network. Michael's role as Director of Homeless Health Care Services was unprecedented in Chicago's medical community. Rather than treating homelessness as a housing problem with medical complications, the new program approached it as a complex web of physical, mental, and social health issues that required innovative solutions. Michael's years on the streets had given him insights that no medical textbook could provide, while his professional training allowed him to translate those insights into effective treatment protocols. The clinic's waiting room was filled with familiar faces from Michael's years of underground medical practice. Martha Henderson, whose diabetes he'd managed with carefully rationed insulin for 3 years, now had regular access to an endocrinologist and proper medication. Carlos Mendez, whose infected leg wound had nearly killed him during the previous winter, was working part-time at the clinic as a translator and patient advocate. Even Big Mike Morrison, the Vietnam veteran who'd been skeptical of official medicine, had agreed to participate in the clinic's revolutionary program that paired medical treatment with job placement and housing assistance. "Doc Bobby," called out Elena Santos, a young mother whose 2 children Michael had treated for respiratory infections during their time in various shelters. "Look at this." She held up an official-looking document with obvious pride. "Housing Authority approved our application. We move into a real apartment next week." Michael felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he witnessed the transformation of lives that had seemed irredeemably broken. Elena's success represented everything the clinic was designed to achieve, not just treating immediate medical problems, but addressing the systemic issues that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty and poor health. Father Miguel appeared at Michael's elbow, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone watching a long-held dream become reality. 37 people housed in the program's first 6 months, he said quietly. 43 enrolled in job training programs. And most importantly, not a single death from preventable medical conditions among our regular patients. The statistics were gratifying, but Michael found himself most moved by the smaller victories. Tommy Chen learning to read at age 45 because proper eyeglasses had revealed that his learning difficulties were actually vision problems, or Jessica Martinez discovering that her chronic fatigue was caused by anemia that could be easily treated once someone bothered to run basic blood work. At noon, Michael was surprised to find Rebecca waiting in his office, wearing her nursing school scrubs and carrying a bouquet of flowers that looked suspiciously like they'd been picked from the hospital's garden. "Shouldn't you be in class?" he asked, though his delight at seeing his granddaughter was obvious. "Clinical rotation got moved to evening shift," she replied, settling into the visitor's chair across from his desk. "Besides, I wanted to be here for your first day." "Dad said to tell you he's proud of you, by the way. He would have come himself, but he's dealing with some crisis at his engineering firm." David Thompson's reconciliation with his father had been perhaps the most miraculous aspect of the past 6 months. The successful businessman who'd spent 7 years believing his father was a disgraced doctor had struggled to reconcile that image with the reality of a man who'd sacrificed everything to help others. Their relationship was still tentative, still marked by careful conversations and unspoken regrets, but it was growing stronger with each phone call and visit. "How are things with you and Dr. Mitchell?" Rebecca asked with the directness that Michael had learned to expect from his granddaughter. "The nurses are all talking about how you two work together like you've been partners for years." Michael felt his cheeks warm slightly. His relationship with Sarah was one of the most complex aspects of his new life. They worked together seamlessly, shared a deep understanding of loss and redemption, and had developed a trust that ran deeper than most marriages. But both of them carried too much history, too much awareness of how their lives had been shaped by tragedy, to rush into anything that might complicate the healing they'd both achieved. "Dr. Mitchell and I understand each other," Michael said carefully. "We've both learned that some relationships are too important to risk by wanting them to be something they're not ready to be." "That sounds very wise and very frustrating," Rebecca observed. "But I guess you've both earned the right to take things at your own pace." The afternoon brought a steady stream of patients whose stories illustrated both the challenges and possibilities of providing health care to Chicago's most vulnerable residents. Michael found himself drawing on skills he'd developed during his years of street medicine, the ability to diagnose conditions without expensive tests, to build trust with patients who'd been failed by the system repeatedly, to see the person behind the addiction or mental illness or simple bad luck that had led to homelessness. At 4 p.m., Sarah knocked on his office door with a stack of paperwork and an expression that suggested important news. "The state health department called," she said, settling into the chair Rebecca had vacated. "They want to use our program as a model for similar clinics across Illinois. There's talk of federal funding, maybe even expanding it nationwide." Michael looked out his office window at the city that had been both his downfall and his redemption. 7 months ago, he'd been a broken man living in the shadows, carrying guilt and grief that seemed too heavy to bear. Now he was being asked to help reshape how America treated its most forgotten citizens. "It ain't about the hand you're dealt," he said, unconsciously echoing his father's wisdom. "It's how you play your cards." "Is that a yes?" Sarah asked. Michael turned back to her, thinking of Tommy Mitchell, whose death had set this entire journey in motion. Thinking of Margaret, whose love had sustained him even after she was gone. Thinking of David and Rebecca, who'd given him a family again. Thinking of all the patients whose lives had been saved, not despite his fall from grace, but because of it. "That's a yes," he said, "but with one condition." "What's that?" "We make sure Tommy Mitchell's name is on the clinic. He's the reason any of this became possible. It seems right that he should be remembered as part of the healing." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I think he would have liked that." Christmas morning arrived with the kind of gentle snowfall that transforms even the grittiest urban landscapes into something approaching magic. Michael Thompson stood at the kitchen window of Sarah Mitchell's brownstone, watching his granddaughter build a snowman in the backyard with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost winters. At 17, Rebecca was technically too old for such activities, but the past year had taught all of them that joy postponed was often joy lost forever. The house smelled of cinnamon rolls and coffee, the kind of domestic comfort that Michael had almost forgotten existed during his years on the streets. Sarah moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage alone, but was slowly remembering the pleasure of cooking for people she cared about. David sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the architectural plans for the new Sacred Heart Community Health Campus, a project that had grown from a single clinic into a comprehensive treatment center that was already being replicated in 12 states. The federal grant came through, David announced, looking up from the blueprints. Full funding for the next 5 years, plus additional money for research and training programs. Michael nodded, but his attention was drawn to a different kind of success story playing out in the backyard. Rebecca had convinced Father Miguel to help with her snowman, and the 60-year-old former Army medic was attacking the project with military precision, creating what appeared to be the most structurally sound snow sculpture in Chicago history. The past year had brought transformations that none of them could have imagined during those dark days in the hospital. The Tommy Mitchell Memorial Clinic had become a national model for homeless health care, treating over 3,000 patients in its first 12 months and achieving housing placement rates that had impressed even the most skeptical government officials. Michael's book about his experiences, The Healing Streets, had become an unexpected bestseller, with all proceeds funding similar programs across the country. More importantly, the clinic had achieved something that traditional homeless services had struggled with for decades. It had created a pathway from the streets to stability that addressed not just housing and employment, but the complex trauma that often kept people trapped in cycles of poverty and despair. But for Michael, the most meaningful success was measured in smaller victories. The relationship with his son had grown from cautious reconciliation to genuine friendship, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than the simple obligations of blood. David had taken a leave of absence from his engineering firm to help design and build the new clinic facilities, channeling his guilt about the lost years into tangible contributions to his father's mission. Sarah's transformation had been equally profound. The woman who'd spent 15 years carrying anger like a shield had discovered that forgiveness wasn't just something she could give to others. It was something she could finally give to herself. Her parents had visited twice, awkward but healing encounters that had allowed the Mitchell family to begin grieving Tommy's death properly for the first time since it happened. "I have an announcement," Sarah said, turning from the stove with a plate of perfectly golden cinnamon rolls. "I've been offered the chief medical officer position at the new campus. Full oversight of all medical services, including the expansion programs." Michael felt his heart skip slightly. For months they'd danced around the question of what their professional relationship might become as the clinic grew larger and more complex. Sarah's medical expertise and administrative skills had been crucial to the program's success, but she'd maintained her position at Chicago General's emergency department, treating their partnership as a consulting arrangement rather than a permanent commitment. "What did you tell them?" he asked carefully. "I told them I'd need to discuss it with my partner first," Sarah replied, and the weight she placed on the word partner suggested she meant more than just professional collaboration. Rebecca chose that moment to burst through the back door, bringing cold air and infectious excitement with her. "The snowman is finished! Father Miguel says it's the finest example of frozen precipitation engineering he's ever supervised. You all have to come see it before it melts." As they bundled into coats and boots, Michael caught Sarah's hand. "About that partnership," he said quietly. "Are we talking about the professional kind or the other kind?" Sarah's smile was answer enough, but she replied anyway. "I think we've learned that the best partnerships are the ones that don't require you to choose." Outside, Father Miguel was indeed standing proudly beside a snowman that looked more like a snow sculpture, complete with carefully carved features and a miniature stethoscope made from twigs and string that Rebecca had contributed. "It's beautiful," Sarah said. And Michael realized she wasn't looking at the snowman, but at the scene itself. 4 adults and 1 teenager standing in a snowy backyard, connected not by blood or obligation, but by the kind of chosen family that emerges from shared purpose and mutual healing. David pulled out his phone to take pictures, and Michael found himself thinking about all the images that would never exist. Family photos that had been lost to 7 years of separation, holidays that had passed unmarked, milestones that had been celebrated alone or not at all. But rather than mourning what couldn't be recovered, he felt grateful for what was being created in the present moment. "I have something for all of you," Michael said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out 4 small boxes, wrapped in tissue paper with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to make the most of limited resources. Rebecca opened hers first, gasping when she saw the delicate silver locket inside. "Grandpa, it's beautiful." "It was your grandmother's," Michael explained. "She always said it should go to the next generation when the time was right." David's gift was their father's watch, the same timepiece that had marked the hours during Michael's years on the streets. "Dad kept this running through 2 wars and the Depression," Michael said. "I figure it can handle whatever challenges you've got coming." Father Miguel received a leather-bound journal filled with Michael's handwritten notes about treating patients with limited resources. "For the next generation of street doctors," Michael said, "in case they need to know how to set a broken bone with newspaper and tape." Sarah's gift was the smallest box, and when she opened it, she found a simple gold ring. Not an engagement ring, but a signet ring engraved with the symbol of the medical profession. "It belonged to the doctor who delivered me," Michael explained. "My mother saved it for 60 years, thinking I might want something to remember him by. I figure it's time it went to someone who understands what it means to heal people." As they stood in the falling snow, passing around hot chocolate that Father Miguel had prepared with military efficiency, Michael realized that redemption looked different than he'd imagined during his years of self-imposed exile. He'd thought it would involve grand gestures, dramatic moments of forgiveness, or perhaps simply the restoration of what he'd lost. Instead, it looked like this: ordinary moments made extraordinary by the presence of people who'd chosen to love him despite his failures. It looked like Rebecca's laughter as she tried to teach David the proper technique for snowball construction. It looked like Sarah's hand finding his as they watched the impromptu snowball fight that had erupted between the generations. "The good Lord never gives you more than you can handle," Michael said quietly, repeating his father's words but understanding them differently now. "But sometimes he gives you more than you ever dared to hope for." As the sun set on Christmas Day, they gathered around Sarah's dining room table for a meal that represented the convergence of several traditions and the creation of new ones. Rebecca said grace with the confidence of someone who'd learned that gratitude was not about perfection, but about possibility. David shared stories about the construction progress at the new clinic. Father Miguel offered a blessing that encompassed not just the food before them, but the journey that had brought them together. Sarah raised her glass of wine for a toast. "To second chances," she said, "and to the people brave enough to take them." Michael looked around the table at faces illuminated by candlelight and love, thinking about the circuitous path that had led from Tommy Mitchell's death to this moment of celebration. The boy whose loss had seemed like pure tragedy had somehow become the catalyst for healing that extended far beyond any single family or institution. "To Tommy," he said quietly, "who taught us all that sometimes our greatest failures become our most important victories." As they clinked glasses and began the meal, snow continued to fall outside the windows, covering the city in a blanket of white that promised new beginnings and fresh starts for anyone brave enough to step outside and leave footprints in unmarked territory. Dear friends, as we conclude this remarkable journey of redemption and healing, I'm reminded that life's greatest gifts often come disguised as our deepest struggles. Michael's story teaches us that it's never too late to rebuild, to reconnect, and to find purpose in our pain. Like many of you, I understand that the golden years aren't always golden. They can be marked by loss, regret, and broken relationships that seem beyond repair. But this Christmas tale reminds us that forgiveness, both given and received, has the power to transform not just our past, but our future. Whether you're carrying guilt from old mistakes, grieving relationships that ended badly, or simply wondering if your best years are behind you, Michael and Sarah's story proves that redemption is always possible when we have the courage to face our truth and the wisdom to accept help from unexpected places. What moment in this story resonated most deeply with your own life experiences? Have you ever discovered that someone you misjudged was actually trying to help you in ways you didn't understand at the time? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.